Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is a monthly wrap-up for November of 2024. So I have a pretty decent stack here, actually. I'm moving stuff around. Stack of books. All of these books I have spoken of more at length inside what I call my Fresh Read Kills videos. So if you want to hear my further thoughts on any of these books, you can go to those videos. Here, I'm just going to give a very brief summary of what I read and just a couple of the thoughts that I had. So I read first a couple of biographies. I started, I think, the month off. I don't know if I'm doing these all in order, but pretty close to it. It's been over a month now since I read this. So we got I Am Malala. The girl who stood up for education was shot by the Taliban by Malala Yousafzai. And this is a pretty famous story, of course. She was in Pakistan. I discovered how much of an activist she already was before the Taliban got onto the bus that she was on and shot her in the head. And of course, she did recover, and she has been a pretty profound activist for girls' education, really before and after. And what I also discovered was how integral her father was, and what an activist and progressive he also was. So it was fascinating to hear about him, and especially as a father of a daughter myself, I couldn't help but admire a lot of what he was saying and doing in the book. That was one of the biggest surprises. But yeah, I enjoyed this quite a bit. It also gave me a lot of insight into the history of Pakistan in the late 20th and early 21st century, which I really appreciated. Another biography that I read was very different. We've got Empire of Imagination, Gary Gygax and the Birth of Dungeons and Dragons by Michael Witwer. So Gary Gygax is one of the co-creators of Dungeons and Dragons, really the person, though, who got the game rolling. He was the head of TSR, the company that owned Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D, for many years, and was really a creative figurehead and a giant in the world of nerddom. Right up until his death. And this is an interesting book. So it's a biography that is written in a much more narrative, sort of novelistic style. So just see if I can find an example here. There's a lot of things like, 8-year-old Gary rode his bike as fast as he could down the hill, and then turn quickly to the right down the next street. That sort of narrative approach. So certain things that the author, of course, is inventing, but it's basically true. But yeah, I like this. And for somebody who is so integral in developing a newer form of storytelling, I didn't mind that storytelling approach to this whole thing. But glad I read this. I enjoyed this. And I read a couple of fiction books for my banned books reading project. Let's see, the first one that I read was Mark Twain, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, I'd sort of read this back in high school, but I really didn't remember a lot. I remembered a lot about the first half, not a lot about the second half. Of course, this has been on the challenged list or banned list in various schools or libraries because of its frequent use of the N-word, and it's in here a lot. It is so important to remember that in the late 19th century, when this was written, this would have been considered a very kind of anti-racist book, even though we today can look back and see a lot of the stereotypes and, the sort of hurtful racial tropes that were still at play in Twain's work. But for its time, it was certainly progressive. And one of the things that I didn't remember from high school was how funny it was. There's actually a lot of really great humor, great moments, and you end up liking the character of Huck quite a bit. But yeah, glad I read this. Definitely appreciated Twain's character work, especially in this. And then I read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. This is the work that he published, I think, was it 1990? So he was a Vietnam vet, and this is sort of like a weird mix between fact and fiction. So these are like almost like fictional short story collections about this same sort of group of soldiers in Vietnam. Some of it's based on things that he actually witnessed and experienced, although everything has been changed in some way. So it's a weird mixture of like memory and sort of artistic catharsis in trying to get these things out in a storytelling format. I did enjoy it overall. I wasn't always comfortable with not knowing what was real and what wasn't. I kind of would prefer one or the other because I'm constantly wondering, did this really happen? Did it not? Which is just kind of distracting for me. I understand it from an artistic point of view, but just as a reader, I would have liked a little more clarity. But still, I thought it was really well done, and it does a really good job. It's not about battle, it's not about war in that respect. It's about the emotional toll, right? The things they carried, yes, physical and emotionally, and psychologically, and scarring, and that sort of thing. How war changes you and beats you down, and I thought it did a pretty good job of showing that. And I read Joseph Campbell's Pathways to Bliss, Mythology and the Personal Transformation. So this is part of the Joseph Campbell Foundation's collected works, things that Campbell kind of wrote or said in different respects, and they've been edited and tried to, put into a book format under certain themes. This isn't the first one I've read like this, but I thought this was pretty decent. It doesn't really tell you how to find your pathway or what a pathway, or how a pathway could be found. It's more about talking about the idea that there is a pathway. He looks at Sigmund Freud, he looks at Jung at different times, but essentially Campbell saw myth as something that we should be interacting with, as metaphor, as something that can bring new meaning to our lives, and he is essentially advocating doing that sort of thing. He's not telling you how to do it, but he's basically saying that it can and should be done. And for that, I thought it was pretty interesting. And I read The Church of St. Thomas Paine, which looked at, so it's the religious history of American secularism. It looked at atheists, freethinkers, that sort of thing of the late 19th century, and how they tried to sort of recreate religion for their own ends. And there were different reasons for this. I didn't really get into it in my last video, but there were reasons for them wanting to sort of create a new religion. And this was a minority of atheists. Most of them didn't want anything to do with the word religion or the word church, but there was a small group, and some of them were successful, some of them were not. The first part of the book looks at the sort of obsession over Thomas Paine, especially his physical remains, in a sort of reliquary type of way, trying to have these Americans basically saw Thomas Paine as like the spiritual predecessor to them. So they wanted to rehabilitate Thomas Paine, who had a very bad name because of his religious views in his own generation. The second part looks at funeral rites and trying to create more secularized funeral rites, and not have preachers officiating at atheist funerals. And lastly, various attempts to create churches, secular churches. And this was all pretty fascinating, pretty interesting. I definitely saw a lot of myself in some of these people. As I mentioned in the video, I wouldn't have said that it was true a few years ago, but I'm seeing it a little bit more these days. So I feel like this is like the perfect time for me to have read this book, and I really liked it. And I finished up the month with Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, and other essays on religion and related subjects. So this was originally published in the 1950s. It is a collection of various things that Russell wrote that kind of all go under the umbrella of religion, and especially promoting things like an atheist worldview and more liberalized views on things like sexuality and free speech, those sorts of things. They were never written by Russell to be included in one collection, but that's how they've been editorialized here. And Russell was alive when they did this. He basically gave it his blessing. These are more like, I would say, almost like philosophical opinion pieces, not necessarily philosophy. I think the best way to read this is to look at it as almost like a historical time capsule of what was atheism and free thought like in the early 20th century. Don't look at it as a guide to now, but more of a snapshot into the past of how things looked. So yeah. Anyhow, I said I was going to try and make this quick, and that's not too bad. So I'm going to try and make a stack here. I had, turn my camera again. Anyhow, what have I got? 7 books here. So I read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Why I'm Not a Christian, The Church of St. Thomas Paine, Pathways to Bliss, Empire of Imagination, and I Am Malala. So if you've read any of these, love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.